Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us today. 5 years ago, Europe was experiencing an unprecedented influx of migrants, mostly from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. As more and more refugees entered into Europe, on August 31st, 2015, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel proclaimed, "Wir schaffen das," or "we'll manage this." At the time, critics said that this statement was a grave mistake, and it remains somewhat controversial today. But how did Germany and Europe manage what has become known as the migration crisis of unprecedented proportion? What's the lasting impact of an estimated 1.1 million migrants who settled in Germany before the end of 2015, and many more since then? These questions deserve a deep and nuanced assessment. Joining us today to share their insights are Jagoda Marinic and Victoria Rietig. Jagoda is the daughter of Croatian guest workers. She studied German, political science, and English at the University of Heidelberg. She's a novelist and writer. She writes for the Frankfurter Rundschau, the Taz, and the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Since 2012, she has been the director of the Intercultural Center in Heidelberg. Victoria is the head of the migration program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, otherwise known as the DGAP. She began her professional career working on migration and development issues at the UN's Institute for Training and Research in New York, and has focused on migration ever since. She has worked at several think tanks in Washington, D.C., including the Migration Policy Institute, and has served as an independent expert for migration, asylum, and refugee issues, advising government agencies and foundations. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
And to lead today's discussion, I'm delighted to welcome Adam Hunter. He's the newly minted Executive Director of the Refugee Council USA, an organization working to protect and welcome refugees, asylum seekers, and other forcibly displaced populations. Adam has more than 15 years experience working on migration, national security, and international affairs issues, and has held positions in government, with foundations, think tanks, and had several fellowships. And to be honest, as somebody who has extensive experience both in the US and in Germany, I can't think of a better person to lead today's discussion. So Adam, with that, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve, and welcome Victoria and Jagoda. Pleasure to be here with you and with all the viewers this morning and this afternoon. I wanted to start with going back to that statement, which was exactly 5 years ago, and asking our panel to reflect on a little bit more nuance of what you think the Chancellor actually meant by saying, "Wir schaffen das." Was it more of a statement of resignation, if you will, recognizing the significant human toll that was being taken and saying that, of course, we can manage this? Or was it a more proactive affirmation that is saying, no, we want to be and remain welcoming and we encourage more people to come? I'd be curious, maybe, Victoria, if you would start with, what did she really mean when she said that? And how has that maybe differed from what's played out?
Well, thanks a lot, Adam, for that. The hardest question you can possibly ask, because it's essentially go into the brain of a woman that you've never met and tell us what she actually meant. So since I don't have my, my mind reading capacities up to snuff, I'll just say two things on this. One is, I think that mostly she was targeting the German audience. I mean, this was to encourage Germans to live up to this historic challenge. She knew that, you know, she's not the woman that gives pep talks on a regular basis, as you may know, but she has a very keen sense for when in the population it is right to say something. She waits and sees where does popular opinion go, and then she makes a statement such as this. So I think largely it should be understood as an encouragement to Germans. The second thing I was gonna say on that, though, is that there's come up a few people, a few experts that were in her circle have mentioned that actually a few days prior, other politicians had had a conversation where she was also part of, where they had actually used this very sentence, and it was repeated by other politicians. So it's questionable in how far did she actually come up with that in that very moment, or simply harked back to what she had heard a few days prior.
And Jagoda, do you agree with that take?
Well, in some aspects, I surely agree with the aspect that she wanted to encourage the people, and because she knew this was a challenge and she would not be able to, the country would not be able to manage well if she did not activate the civic society and did not make them part of this. And I would like to add that in this time, Germany already wanted a sort of a change in the approach to migration. We were back in 2015, and the term Willkommenskultur was coined back then with the idea of presenting Germany as a more open country, more open to diversity, very aware of the demographic crisis that we are still confronted with. So I think she also coined this concept of solidarity and an image of Germany that would be open. But I would maybe go back to the whole thing she said. Wir schaffen das is just the most renowned. The whole thing she said was, we have managed a lot of things. And if we don't, and then she said, we will manage this, or yes, we can. And then she said, and if we don't, this is no longer this is not my country, or this is no longer my country. And I find this very telling, because she comes from a Christian background. Though I can't read her mind either, I still believe that it also came from a deep belief in humanitarian action, in a term of, if we are Christian, and she is the head of a Christian party still, then we do have to show some kind of a Christian face. And in that term, I don't think it was spontaneous, but confronted with images she never saw coming, I think she had this also. We don't see her that way. We speak of Teflon Merkel, but I think she did have an emotional moment that Germany and Europe cannot not manage this crisis. I think it was a deep belief that we have to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Victoria, going back to you, how prepared would you put Germany's policy stances on migration at the time to manage the crisis as it was unfolding? And what have you observed has been the significant changes to better manage it in the years since?
Yeah. I think half of our migration policies were very well equipped for this, and the other half absolutely not, and they haven't been updated since. What do I mean by that? So, wir schaffen das, when we look at the, most observers have looked at the integration side. So how well has integration actually progressed since then? How well have we managed to open up and make these people part of Germany? And I think when we look at what did we have in place in 2015 to integrate newcomers, the answer is a whole lot. And why? Because 2015 was preceded by a period of about 15 years that I coined the integration only period in German migration policies. And that was basically an understanding that had developed in the late 90s, early 2000s, that you actually have to help newcomers integrate if you want to reap the benefits of migration and not create so-called parallel societies, right? So that was our big mistake in the second half of the 20th century, when we had a lot of migrants arriving, but we treated them as guest worker, aka actually as guests, right? Under the assumption they're going to leave, and we didn't invest into them. And that, of course, then came back to bite us. So finally, in the early 2000s, that did change. And then between 2000 and 2015, a lot of political will and a lot of financial resources and a lot of policies were essentially adapted and that were channeled into the goal of integration of migrants. We had a huge overhaul of German migration law in 2005 that put integration center stage. And then between 2005 and 2015, there was a lot of infrastructure that was built up on the federal level, but also on the local level, and just a lot of financial resources and other resources that were poured into this, right? So by 2015, when this happened, we knew that we have to actually activate that machinery. And it was a machinery at that point, right? And that is in part of why so many initiatives then were able to pop up all of a sudden and help this whole integration process. And I think that when we look at the integration outcomes, we see that that actually has helped the integration of newcomers, right? So That's the one side. Integration policies had been built up and then kicked into action when they were needed. But the other side of the migration coin, we weren't really that well prepared for. And that is, well, you have to not just find an answer to what do you do with people who stay, who come and then get to stay, but what do you do with the people that come and then don't have a legal right to stay? And that is the kind of harder question oftentimes, because it involves all kinds of, what I call the dirty underbelly of migration policies, right? It's the exclusionary part, it's the selective part, it's the how do we deal with people when they are there, even though they don't have a right to being there. And on that area, we really have not made the progress that we need to make to update our policies, to acknowledge that this is a big problem. And unless we address it, we're going to create a permanent underclass of people that live in our country. I'm talking specifically about people in deferred deportation. We have now more than 200,000 people in that status. That's twice as many as 7 years ago. And we have about 50,000 people without any legal status whatsoever. And there's unfortunately very little political will to address this problem, even though if we look 5 years further, that is really where we need to get started on, unless, again, we want to have a situation where we say something is coming back to bite us that we didn't address in time.
Yep, no, it's a very important point that we're going to definitely be unpacking. Before we get to that, though, Jagoda, I'd be curious from the view from Heidelberg and in your work. I mean, you were in your role in 2015, 2016, when these inflows really reached their peak. What was the view like for you? How well did you feel the city was prepared? How did you manage the influx of new populations? And what have you learned over the course of the past few years that has been built into new programming and new policies locally?
Yeah, this was very interesting for me to listen because, Victoria is very right. Germany has learned its lessons from the guest worker era, which is my parents' era, and I know the faults and flaws of this policies from like my own private experience. But some things they have not learned, like for example, the generation of my parents, when they arrived here, they arrived with a working permission. So when they came here, the issues were not about, are they going to be fed by us? And we did not have that social envy about what's going to happen that really got a big issue in Germany. So I think there's something that they also unlearned from back then, and that was making people capable of creating their own lives and making it as fast as possible to get access to jobs and so on. And so on one terms, Germany was improving, like Victoria said, in the last 15 years about the whole policies around integration. But on the other hand, this specific moment of 2015 has still been something so different. I mean, we had over 1 million immigrants or migrants and refugees back in the war former Yugoslavia. So Germany already had managed 1 million refugees in the 90s. And we know what happened then. We had the asylum homes burning, and we had a huge change in the asylum laws that were made back then. So we manage and don't manage. You always have this bipolar identity in Germany. Like there's a huge part of the society that manages, and then there's a middle part of the society that sort of is not able to create a good dialogue about what's going on, and also not able to communicate the positive things that are going on. And then you have the radical right and the radical extremism that very soon finds a way to promote this into concrete violence. Like also after 2015, we have an increase in violence against refugees, migrants, but also the first murder of a German politician since the Second World War. So when we go about how have I seen this in the city, I was honestly very, very positively impressed by people. I'm a writer by profession. I have studied. I have never had maybe such a positive image of bureaucrats. I always thought, well, there's the ones who are maybe hiding behind things and trying not to make things possible. And then I saw all these people making things possible. So there was the civic society, people who helped on a ehrenamtlich level, as we say in German, on a voluntary basis. But then you had incredible people in the structures of cities who did what Merkel asked them to. They did Wir schaffen das. They worked overtime. They created structures. Like when they arrived in Heidelberg, we had a huge arrival center with like 6,000 people suddenly in a small area of maybe 13,000 people living. So every third person was a refugee in that area. Then you had to provide infrastructure, health, security. You had to check the people who came here for health. All this had to be organized. So on the one hand, Victoria is right, like we had the structure in Germany, and on the other hand, we did not have it. So I think Merkel did not really give food to her Wir schaffen das. She said, yeah, we can do this, Germany can do this. But the people in the cities who had to do it, they really gave all their best, they gave all their strength, they worked overtime. And suddenly they were like, okay, but what did she actually mean with Wir schaffen das? When are there going to be the big programs who will help us? How are we fund and finance all these things? Are the cities going to be financing all this? So who is the we she was talking about? Is it the little cities, or is it the federal level, or is it the national level? Who is it actually? And I think in this time, she created a lot of insecurity. And she had the fight going on with Horst Seehofer from the CSU, who kind of said, no, what she did was like the beginning of a Unrechtsstaat, like a state without law. And so she had, I think, a moment of, oh God, which direction are we going to go? And we know where she finally went to, because the borders of Europe are representing the decision of that time. And I have a huge respect for Heidelberg, and I have a cultural center where we have a cultural dialogue, which is the easiest and nicest part of it all. But the tough part is to help people through health, education, working, find work, and all this has to be done structurally. You cannot rely on the civic society. Sure, you need people, and there was a huge openness in Germans to help. I mean, the number of Germans, I think we had 9 million people who were engaged in voluntary work to make all this possible. But that story was not told. We were talking about 20,000 people in the East who were demonstrating with Pegida, talking about how they don't want to do this, though they didn't have to do all the work. And in the West, where all the people had to do the work, yeah, I think they felt overwhelmed. And the approval Merkel had in the beginning, people were enthusiastic about the image of Germany they could finally present. They had to withdraw, and now she doesn't have the approval rates of back then. People felt overwhelmed. And I think it's a pity that Wir schaffen das was never actually put into any kind of policy. It was said, it was promoted, it was meant maybe, but it was never translated in concrete political measures that would help the cities and the people who are confronted with the effects of the policy with how to handle this.
Mm-hmm. And it's fair to say that the real underscoring challenges are a function of both overall numbers, but also the pace of those numbers. And I think that there was more of an expectation at the time that on both of those questions, other European neighbors were going to be sharing in some of that challenge and in rising to that challenge, which didn't unfold maybe as some of the more optimistic voices who still believed in Dublin back in 2015 might have hoped for, and that added some extra burden. I'd be curious, so looking back from today, from where we are today, it's striking that Merkel, despite the challenges and the political machinations and even a headline that I saw just 1 year after 2015 and 2016 from Politico magazine that said the phrase that haunts Merkel the most, right? She herself on Friday said that she'd essentially do the same thing, right? How do you make, or let me ask, what do you think strikes as the most successful element supporting that position, that this was good for Germany, we've done a good job, and we could do it again? What are maybe the highlights you would tick off of where we've come now in the past 5 years? And Victoria, if you want to start, please.
So basically what went well in the last 5 years? What would make somebody justified in saying, hey, we did well, we managed?
Indeed.
I mean, there's tons of good news you can point to, and a lot of people, and in media in the last few days, if you followed, it has been full of those examples, right? So here's the good news avalanche to you. Half of people are in work only 5 years after arrival. That is a very good result, especially given that in the first few years, it didn't look as if they were going to enter the labor market so quickly. In fact, this cohort of arrivals has entered the labor market more quickly than the cohort in the 1990s. which in part is because we simply have a better labor market going on with lower unemployment, so it's always easier to get a job. But in part is also because we've invested in the integration into the labor market, so that is now paying off. And in the first few years, people were, we call it the lock-in effect. They were in language training, they were in labor market preparation courses, all kinds of things that help them not just get into a job, but possibly something that could become a career afterwards, right? So that's the great news, right? Half in work. 3/4 actually now live in their own apartments or houses. I mean, housing is, you know, a little bit of a dull topic to many people, but if you think about it, that actually is an incredibly important thing. Where you live determines to a large degree how well you can integrate. And 3 out of 4 have moved out of, you know, communal facilities and are now in their own places. And of course, that then has positive impacts, for instance, on children who have, you know, space to study. It has positive impacts on family life, all kinds of things. And that has really jumped in the last few years. In 2016, it was only half of people, and now it's 3/4. More good news, 95% of arrivals that are children, so under the age of 18, actually are in school or vocational education and training. And the vast majority of them, about 80%, say, I feel at home here, I feel good here, I feel integrated here, right? So these are all really good numbers, but there's also some happy images that we see and that have now come up. You see the first cohorts of newly arrived youngsters graduating from high school, from gymnasium, you know, with top marks. And of course, that is, you know, who didn't speak a word of German 5 years ago and are now graduating at a level of, you know, with marks that really are hard to get for Germans, you know, who've grown up here and spoken this. So all of these are really, really, you know, giving credence to this narrative. Yes, we've done well there, and the refugees have done well, and we have done a lot of things that we can be proud of. But this happy narrative, it's not incorrect, but it is incomplete, because it masks the fact that for some groups it's been going really, really well, and for other groups a little less well, not just because of where they come from or what kind of education they bring with them, but also simply because based on what kind of opportunities we've given to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe we can start unpacking some of that with you first, Jagoda, and particularly Victoria had spoken of, you know, those who were not granted their asylum status and who are potentially removable and have been asked to leave but aren't. What have been the policies in your area with regard to the Länderkompetenzen around removing people and what that looks like? And how are you at the Intercultural Center engaging with those who have their deferred deportation or the geduldete status?
Well, that was a huge question even when we started founding the International Welcome Center. The question was, well, you know, we want to have a welcome culture, but we will also have to let people know that they are not welcome. And how are we going to do this? And can we call ourselves a welcome center when there's people we simply do not welcome? And then I think the agreement was like the decision is rarely made here. So mainly people here are just letting people know. So what we wanted to have is a good structure, a good way to let them know. Also creating structures to help them go back. So it means that when they would be informed about the decisions, that they could have NGOs around to help them, or that we would bring them together with people who have been trained to resettle them back so they would feel kind of safer. But I think that is, as you said, the vulnerable point in the whole idea of welcome culture, that it has proven to be not possible, not in this situation Europe is in, not in the laws that we have, that certain people are welcome and others are not. So yeah, I think that's difficult, and I think we should, because I just saw something also about talk about, you said, how did we handle this in Heidelberg? In the Intercultural Center, we have just a wonderful space where people can debate and discuss. So we had an evening where we had a mayor in-house and people from Eastern Germany who had experienced a very negative reaction from their neighbors after they had been practicing welcome culture and been open to refugees. We brought them together, and there was a German asylum NGO who actually confronted the mayor with certain decisions. They said, here's a family we really have been accompanying, and we love the kids, and they're home in the schools, and why does this family has to go back? And it was quite a tough moment. And there you have a mayor, there you have an NGO, the family you're talking about is not there. But the NGO afterwards just came to me and said, you know, this means so much to us to have a space where we can discuss it, to not do it behind closed doors, to confront the mayor in public and say, okay, these are what you are, these are the things you were talking about in public, these are your political measures, how can we match them, and what are you doing to us? Because we help these families arrive, you want us to help them because we actually help you to have less work, and then you leave us alone without these people. So you have very emotional confrontations around these laws, and it shows that we talk about, you know, as you said, we give these things big names, but on a everyday level you have people standing in front of each other's with hopes that are ruined, kids that have been home in these schools, as Victoria said, they feel they are German and they feel welcome, they feel home. And I have not found a better solution than we have to be truthful to law. We have to send people back that cannot be granted an asylum here, and yet do it in a way that is a little more human, and not just pick them out of their beds at midnight and say it's time to leave the country. I think this is something we will have to live with. But what I find interesting at the moment is to see that, for example, COVID is affecting a lot of refugees because they have been, they have found jobs in the low wage sector, and they are not able to live in, to work in home office. So it's also them who get fired first. And you see that they are integrated, as Victoria said, the numbers are quite well, actually quite impressive. But on the other hand, they are very vulnerable group still. It's like, you know, they are the first on the list or the last on the list to be cut out of what we think has to be helped. So if there's a crisis, then the refugee co-worker might be the first to be fired. And I think that's also a difficult thing that comes back to the city level, that people have to deal with that, the disappointment and also the financial costs of that.
Thank you for raising the COVID context. I wanted to go, maybe Victoria, did you want to get in on that too? Because I think the COVID overlay is an important one, as we've seen also in the United States, a lot more visibility around those in essential worker service positions and the visibility and importance that has entailed.
Happy to say something about COVID impact, but I just wanted to commend Jagoda because this was exactly spot on what she said there about the problem of returns and deportations. This is exactly what I agree with, that we have the responsibility to come up with a system that is transparent and fair. And so when people receive a no at the end of their asylum claim, then there has to be a way to return them. But it doesn't have to be for everybody, right? It depends very much on how long have these people been there. Are the kids in school? Are they well integrated? Have these people, do they have a criminal record? I think what we really, really need to have in Germany is this conversation about, there's 250,000 people without a legal status. Which of these people do we really have to return because they present a danger to the people around them, or because of something that they have not achieved or achieved? But also, who gets to stay even though they haven't gotten this official yes on their humanitarian claim? Because there's many reasons other than humanitarian claims of why you could make the point that these people should still get a right to stay. And I call this double strategy of regularization and returns. So giving people, like taking people out of this legal limbo status and giving them either a legal status that is safe, where they can make plans for their future, for their children, etc., or actually putting the resources behind these structured returns, including deportations of those people where we really say these people have no business being in Germany. And I think that, you know, Adam, we earlier spoke about what are the parallels to the United States. I mean, obviously that is one big parallel. We have an unauthorized community that is growing in Germany. And the United States, we see, you know, that it isn't going all that well, to put it, you know, not too strongly. And unless we find a better way of addressing that, a more humane way, but also a way that gives greater credibility to the asylum system, unless we find that, we are going to have a huge problem in 5 or 6 years down the road.
Yeah, no doubt. And there's even a COVID overlay to that decision making now of how to go about and where can you actually remove folks in the pandemic climate. That's another considering factor. We're getting a couple of questions. I wanted to go back a little bit more to dig in on Willkommenskultur and what we mean, Jagoda, since you raised this most specifically around the criteria for what that entails. And if you could talk a little bit more about the rise in hate crimes that you've also observed and how that has interrelated with some of these policy developments.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have, yeah, I'm also, I surely want to, yeah, promote the narrative that we have managed, wir haben es geschafft, yeah, to be, if we look at the numbers, we haben es geschafft. And it's no surprise, Germany has done so many things, and I don't know, I wouldn't know why 80 million wouldn't have been able to integrate 1 million people. I think I never had a doubt, but there were people who had that doubt. And if you go back to a moment right after Angela Merkel said, wir schaffen das, it was Alexander Gauland from the AfD who said, you know, Merkel said, wir schaffen das, but maybe we don't want to. Wir wollen das nicht schaffen. And we have not only had an experienced a rise in right extremist violence, and we have actually experienced a first right party in the German parliament, in a numbers of German federal states. We have almost had a coalition between the federal party and the AfD, which is which for some people would have been like unimaginable before 2015. So if you speak about what happened with hate crimes, hate speech, more racism, I think it's quite shocking. Many people were very proud of Germany when you had all these right parties around Europe entering parliaments. Everybody said, you know, yeah, but Germans had done so many things well with the the remembrance culture of the Holocaust, and people are better trained to recognize racism. People have a history that they will not easily, yeah, fall back into this kind of hate speech. And after 2015, it seems like the threshold had really been crossed, and yeah, there were things possible to say in public that some thought wouldn't be possible to say. And there's always people, like I said, when the Yugoslavian refugees came here, we had a right extremist violence against asylum houses. And now it's violence against synagogues, against, in Hana, we had shisha bars, so it's anti-Islamic. And you have all this violence going on. And we have a lot of talk about right extremism in the German police, which is something Horst Seehofer doesn't want to address the way he could to bring more clarity into this issue. So I think 2015 and everything that happened has really, like COVID, people say COVID is like a microscope. It makes all these little things bigger and we understand the problems of our society. I think it started with 2015. It just microscopically gave us insight into the heads, because Germany before 2015, you sometimes wouldn't even know where people really are. You know, we had a quite homogeneous way of doing politics. Merkel did her silent way of governing. So suddenly 2015 was actually a breakout of a political debate in between friends, families. Germans were not as political as many other countries I experienced in the public. And suddenly they were back into a front line. Like there's things people can't talk to if they love each other because they're on so different standpoints that they stop talking to each other. And I think that Germany is now in a moment where we really need strong narratives for the future, to not be blocked by very old forces and not be threatened by these forces that are now coming up and they feel so strong. We had yesterday the Sturm auf den Reichstag, as they would call it. I would just say that some people stumbled over the Rasen in front of the Bundestag, and that most of Germans would never agree on that being a success. But still, there's forces trying to promote these images, and they're extremely right forces, and they do get even the police structures. We're not like Hanau. In Hanau, the addresses of people who get murder threats, they got their addresses from a police server, so from a police computer. So suddenly it was obvious that the people sending out the threats to kill migrant women or people in public who would be for an open society, they get the information from people working at the police in Hessen. So Germany does have huge issues at the moment, and I don't know if we are addressing them strong enough. So telling the story of the success of Wir schaffen das is certainly one thing would have to foster, but also looking at the structures that have been built in the last 20 years that seem to be quite strong in organizing right extremist violence against very normal people, like in shisha bars, Islamophobic attacks.
Mm-hmm. Well, and politically, going to Victoria, and certainly there's a COVID tie into this too, but the CDU numbers are up, the AfD is down, the Greens are up astronomically. So these right-wing movements, while they've had their outbursts and certainly the significant violence, they've not expanded their attraction. How much of this would you say, picking up on Jagoda's observation, is really part of a reckoning, a revealing and a reckoning that at this point certainly has to do with migration and people in Germany, but the factual matter of in the COVID climate, there's not new people moving around really anywhere right now. So how much of this really is a reckoning that is now coming to be, that is akin to what we're seeing in the United States with Black Lives Matter, that is looking at how police are policing civilian populations, that are looking at issues of inclusion of persons of color? Was this maybe somewhat of an inevitable track that was going to happen in Germany, even if the migrant crisis of 2015 didn't occur?
Well, nothing is inevitable, to quote Angela Merkel at her Harvard address, right? Everything that you see can be undone. It has been made by people. So, I don't think that there was an inevitable thing. I don't know if I have a good answer to what you asked, but I do want to make the one point about COVID. Not all consequences of COVID are negative, and I completely agree that the fact that the support for populist parties has actually decreased since then, and other more centrist parties' support has increased since then, is actually a quite positive outcome, especially if we keep in mind that German elections aren't far off. I don't know in how far migration really plays into that. I think the larger reason for that is simply that the crisis management, while criticized by some people demonstrating in Berlin yesterday, but the crisis management of the government, of Merkel, is overall seen as extremely positive. And I think that is the case, both it is viewed internationally quite positively, but also within the country. There's just a great gratefulness of people that we as Germans feel, or a lot of people also, if you look a little bit on social media, not just within your own bubble, but you see that people are grateful to be in a country where the health system is working relatively well, and where we are led by politics that are based on science. These are all, these days, things to really be deeply grateful for. And I think that gratefulness then translates into actual political support. And that is what we've seen. Again, I'm not sure I've answered your question.
Let me ask maybe a different way. You both seem very nuanced in your characterizations of recognizing the increased right-wing extremism, but also not fully expressing a catastrophic concern, right? That this is something kind of well within the bounds of what society can handle. And yes, there was a significant political assassination in 2019, and there's been other flare-ups, but this is not the meta trend that we are seeing. Would you agree with that, or would you characterize it maybe differently?
I agree that the trend of right-wing extremism and right-wing violence has been pointing upwards, and I agree that that is an extremely worrisome trend that we see in Germany, that we see in other European countries, that we see in the United States, that we see unfortunately around the world. Ask this question right now, as of today in Germany, do I think that is the greatest and most catastrophic of all issues that we have to deal with? Not necessarily. It is definitely something that, I mean, discrimination is a huge problem in Germany. Islamophobia is a huge problem in Germany. Make no mistake about that. Obviously, we have those problems, and they are big. But I am not at the stage where I say our democracy is so seriously floundering is not a word, sorry, is not seriously stumbling, and because of that, because when you look at the numbers of people expressing those extreme views, when you look at the numbers of demonstrators, not just, you know, the few dozen that made it in front of the Reichstag, but really it was a few 10,000 of people that demonstrated there. But you have, you know, demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people that represent kind of the other side of Germany, including the, you know, the Wir sind mehr campaign, the We Are More, right? That numerically, there's just so many more people in Germany that do not hold these extreme views and that they're standing up for it. That I would say, as long as we see that, as long as we see this clear outnumbering of the extreme fringe that is part of every society, but as long as we see this extreme outnumbering and now it gets important, and an actual political will to address this more aggressively than we have in the past, then I'm not worried. And that's the point I think that Jagoda was also pointing at, right? Seehofer, our interior minister, there could be a lot more to deal with right-wing extremism in our police forces. And my hope is that the pressure from these Wir sind mehr campaigns, etc., are eventually going to lead to these steps being made.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, this
that
was...
answer it better.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Jagoda.
No, Adam, I just wanted to say this was a maybe very clever way to look through me, though we are here only talking online. I think everything I say has to do with the Obama campaign was all about hope, if you remember. These big posters, hope. And whatever I do is, I come from an immigrant family. I simply believe that hope is something we cannot give up as human beings and as democratic societies. But we also know where Obama's hope brought the US. So, I mean, hope is not the solution. We have to get into action. And since you ask so clearly, I am more worried than I would maybe even like to confess, and I'm very in public. But you want to keep the humor, because I think humor is a good way to fight right-wing policies, not to let them win with the kind of hate they are fostering in societies. But when you have this overall perspective, global, and I mean the German-American relationship is also so tested through the last years, and we have always looked up in a way to what's going on in the US. So who's going to provide the Germans with a compass if Trump is like killing every compass we ever could show to at the moment? Sorry to be so clear, but the value system that the Germans have learned from the US after the Second World War in all this re-education program, it took such a long time to be understood, to be internalized by the people, to bring it into action. And now that maybe many people have, maybe you could say that Wir schaffen das was an embodiment of re-education, like to believe in a human standpoint. You get the US like giving you the worst examples sometimes of hate speech right from the Twitter account of the US president. You have not truth, but fake news, which is a perverted word in itself. You know, if it's fake, it's not news, it's just lies, and they should not be presented as news, and so on. But Germany is like every other country, copying the mechanisms that we can see in the US. So nobody knows how to handle this, and it would be very naive to believe that Germany would be better off, and that with all the positive things we've had, we are a very wealthy country all in all. We have a very good social welfare system, so you can rely on the German middle class. But if we have COVID ruling for we don't know how long, and if we have this financial crisis going on for so long, and if this shakes the welfare base of a country, I don't know where this is going. And it's not like we're so afraid of only the right wings, but there's many people with from even the diverse Germany has authoritarian groups. So you don't have to be like a native born German to become an authoritarian thinker. You can be from Poland, you can be from Hungary, from anywhere and be in this country. And if they kind of bond, you get very strong forces that are authoritarian and anti-democratic. And I do think we have to be very serious about this. I don't think it's a coincidence that Steinmeier today said we have to defend democracy. Like, we should not allow people to create images like yesterday, that somebody so foolishly is even too much of an euphemism for what they did, to get images of how they conquer the Bundestag, the German Bundestag, like the image of German transparent democracy. I really think that we have to be serious about this, and especially since all this hate threatens people with a migration background. We had this Me Too thing going on. It was mentioned in the questions, like the Me Too, not the Me Too for women, but the Me Too for Germans with a migration background. So people with a migration background are getting more and more scared out of the public. They think, okay, if I speak up, I'm risking my life. Should I? And after Walter Lübcke, who was shot as a German politician, and still the political measures are not strong enough. Many migrants think, well, if it's not enough to shoot a German politician to take real action, what actually does it mean? So we have now a cabinet on Rechtsextremismus that is going to find some solutions, I hope, for this problem. But we have to be aware that in Germany, in East Germany, the structures that were built in the last 20, 30, 40 years, where the CDU was much of what we would think of the AfD today. So I think this link of the CDU back then being very similar to what the AfD is doing now, maybe it also means that Germany has come to be very progressive. So you will not find the CDU that sounds like the AfD anymore. And many people hope it will stay like this. But there will be a danger in the East first that they reconnect. And it has shown with what happened with the FDP, with Kemmerich and the AfD. So there was something many Germans would have never expected, that Lindner would sort of, for the first day, say, well, it's an option to rule, so why not? You know, it was a rule out to rule with the help of right-wing forces. And if this threshold falls, I don't know what's going to go on in Germany. And I think it's very important we sustain this wall of democratic parties fighting for democratic values, and being very aware that democracy is something we have to regain and fight for every day, and not let these forces in by compromising or by whining or by saying we need to be heard, or by promoting the narratives they find and bringing the democratic parties into a position of defense. I find it very important that we don't set the agenda for a long time. And even though we laugh about the 40,000 people in Berlin demonstrating against COVID, again, it's the right thinkers that set the agenda of the public debate. So many of the things we have talked now, like the successes of 2015, the successes of integration, nobody's going to read that. Nobody's interested, because they're interested in the scenario of Attila Hildmann, the vegan cook, being brought away by the police, and you have no freedom of speech in Germany. So they foster their rhetorics and they implement in the people's heads. And we stop talking about the real democratic things. We have to make sure we can give it to the people and to a democracy that has to be sane and not mentally displaced in a way.
Thank you for expounding on the comments and really linking a lot of these issues together and bringing it back to core democratic values and a lot of the defensive posture that we find ourselves in. I know it's impossible to completely do so, and divorcing kind of migration from the whole political context and of course the COVID context. But I'm curious if you would think, because often a lot of the views on migration policies, and particularly asylum, are similarly seen as defensive, right? It's kind of wait until a crisis happens and try to figure it out. And I wonder if you would reflect on the successes of the past 5 years, in particular in Germany, as maybe providing a different opportunity for Germans to affirmatively describe the migration policies they want and that can advantage Germany in the future and that makes sense in a European context, in a new European context that has yet to be fully shapen. And by that I mean, are there political opportunities in the near term, whereby more robust either resettlement or proactive visa policies can be explored, given the Willkommenskultur that might not have been contemplated just a few years back. And is there any hope on what a new regime of European solidarity, which itself as a term for me sounds too defensive, right? But kind of a European engagement or proactive engagement can look like out of these lessons? Maybe to Victoria first. I'd love for you both to weigh in.
What's the likelihood of Germans now looking back at the last 5 years and saying, well, overall we did quite well, so how about our migration agenda here and perhaps Europe-wide is becoming a little more open? Very low. I'm very sad to say it, but I think that we should not, I don't think we should bathe in this happy glow by saying, well, it's gone relatively well, so that must mean that we now become progressive in our migration policies. I think all to the contrary. Merkel said interesting things, right? She said that it was right to say wir schaffen das, and it was right to do this, but we should also never repeat it again, right? So that's a little bit schizophrenic. And I think the overall perception in German politics, especially given the elections, is that it's very good if we don't talk too much about migration right now. The less we talk about migration right now, the better for, let's focus on the things that are right now in front of our faces, which is usually COVID. And I think that there is a great hesitation by any politician from the kind of moderate spectrum to engage this topic too openly and to make it too much their own topic, because they know that it might fall on their feet again. When you ask, so that's Germany-wide, and then when you look at the EU level, I mean, there's the new pact that might or might not come out. I mean, it was meant to be published in the spring, then it was meant to be published in the summer, now it's meant to be published by end of September. We don't know whether it's gonna happen this year, but even if it does happen, I think what transpires from conversations of people that are part of the negotiations is that it's going to be the lowest common denominator, and the lowest common denominator in Europe is very low. So we're likely going to see a more of the same of the last years, perhaps packaged in some new language. But basically, there is this incredible blockage within Europe and within the interior processes. And as long as that blockage is there, the attention is focusing outward. The attention is focusing on externalizing migration policies, working with countries at the periphery of Europe in the hopes that migration flows can be steered or stemmed right there. And all of these things that we've seen develop over the last few years, I think that is the trend that we're going to see also going into the future. So I respect everyone who has who has a hope that the new pact might bring some new ideas, but my worry is that there will be some language around greater solidarity, but flexible solidarity, right? That's the catchphrase. We're gonna have flexible solidarity, which might in effect lead to a lot of countries doing what they want to do, investing in border control, investing in exteriorization, but not a lot of people actually doing what needs to be done, which is actually dealing with the people that arrive, taking them in, supporting financially integration or other solutions for them. So I'm sorry that I have to give you such a bleak outlook. Perhaps Jagoda views this differently or can put a positive spin on it.
Well, being positive in these times. There's one thing that I will come to at last where I do think it can have a positive outturn, but it's very funny that we said Merkel she still thinks she would do everything the way she did back then. I think I've rarely heard a politician say he would not do what he did or she did. So I think it's kind of understandable that she would, but maybe it's important to think back of the fact that she didn't think she would be doing what she done. When she agreed on opening the border to Hungary, she actually agreed on 10,000 people coming in. So she didn't see the next month that would happen. So I think we have to be very, very aware that she was maybe overwhelmed by the following weeks of that decision. She thought we cannot produce images like from people coming to German borders and then we throw in military forces to get them away. We need peaceful images, and it's 10,000 people, it will work. But what they did not expect was that it's going to be like weeks and weeks of people coming in. And that's why in Germany, the big word is like push factor. When everything you say, like treating people well, giving them language courses, helping them find a job, there's also a tendency of these, we shouldn't do that because whatever we do well makes them come. So we are in this dialectic of, to do it well, we have to do it well, but if we do it well, then we provoke maybe something that this nation and even the European continent doesn't seem to be ready for. And amidst of COVID, I don't see to get them ready anywhere in the next years, as Victoria so yeah, so sadly put into words. It's really true. But I think it's important to remember that there are still many young people, especially, who are really, really agent provocateurs. And I do believe that, like with the climate change and with these things, that they will not let the inhuman powers just do their things. So like you had now Bansky sending out the boat, creating these images. We should remember the power of these images. We have members of the European Parliament who come out of activism, actually, like Erik Marquardt or others, and go to the European borders and don't get tired pointing out about the living conditions and that we are afraid of being with 3 people in a room, but then we allow people to be in thousands under conditions with no hygienic order. The double moral issues that Europe is creating. I've just passed the Croatian-Austrian border and you see how it is structured so people can't come in. And we sometimes deny, we live in denial, we live in a constant denial, and that's where Europe was actually, was surprised in a state of denial. When 2015, 1 million people came, this million was just the tip of the iceberg. We have more than 70 million by now, which half of them are kids who are refugees worldwide. And it's not Europe who's saving them, it's a lot of poorer countries who are taking care of them. So I think the refugee crisis is just one symptom of the incapability of Europe to find a strategy where to place themselves in the world, to find themselves responsible for anything that goes on a global scale. And that's where I have this little thing of hope that there is a huge debate in Germany, especially in the cultural sector, about the post-colonial heritage Germany has to handle, about how we have treated Africa, and even the whole things about Black Lives Matters. It's a very small minority in Germany, but they are forcing a dialogue about German history in Africa, about new responsibilities, about, yeah, it's just the beginning. But if this continues, then there will be another public debate about the African continent where many people came from and about how to organize the relationship. And I think it won't be possible to totally forget about the migration program, to be so in denial like we used to be before 2015. I feel like it's a curtain that we opened, you know, it's like we lived like that, you know, nobody wanted to see there's 70 million in need, look at them. And then 2015 was a shock, and then they are trying to bring back this curtain, and but you know, I don't think they'll succeed. And that's where I think we are at the moment, yeah.
I share in the optimism that there is a reckoning afoot that will hopefully keep doors open and lenses wider than they have been. A very quick final question before Steve closes us out. We have, and you've observed, a bit of reduced pressure on migration right now because of COVID, because of the success of the past 5 years. With your migration policy hats, what recommendation would you have to try to fix or have a conversation about or get right now in order to be better positioned to manage in the future? What's the one thing you would do if you had a magic wand? Maybe first Victoria, and then Jagoda, if you can close us out.
Experiment, experiment, experiment. In a time when you have low arrivals, that is the time when you can reform things and when you can try out small programs, you know, of perhaps legal pathways you've never tried before, or let's see some different way of processing something. It's usually the attention comes when the crisis comes, and then the answer is usually, well, we need a structural reform. But then people say, well, I can't structurally reform. I have to work on the crisis, right? And then you work on the crisis and you muddle through the crisis. And then once the crisis is over, and in this case, COVID actually, yes, it is to some degree giving a respite in that a lot of the administrative wheels are very slowly turning these days, if turning at all, right? I mean, there's some things that are simply have come to a crashing halt. Deportations is one of them. Now is the time when we would have to actually take this look at, okay, we need to structurally reform this. Can we now, where we're only dealing with a few hundred or a few thousand cases and not with hundreds of thousands of cases, can we try out to do this in a new way? That would be the thing to do. In fact, that is what I have told a lot of people in private conversations of, why don't you try and do this? Why don't you try and do this? Yeah. But the sad truth is that unless there is a great spotlight on something that then pushes political will and finances, it is very hard to get structural reform going.
Yeah.
Again, I'm so sorry. I don't want to end
on
such a sad note always.
Optimism to close out.
Yeah.
But Jagoda is closing it, so she's the optimistic German. I'm the Teutonically serious one, you know?
Well, I would say, if it's one thing, I would say set the agenda and tell the stories you want to tell. I was talking to a friend, and when she was so overwhelmed by these news, you know, imagine COVID appeared, and then for I think 8 weeks we had all the news, the Tagesschau from 8 to 8:15 covering COVID, like 3 new cases somewhere. It's like you never report an airport falling down with 50 people. So the next thing was the special on COVID afterwards, another 20 minutes. Then the next news, 21:45, everything was about COVID. So you could not act. And I think if there's one thing we have to learn from this, you have to set the agenda. And there was a huge, a big analysis on this media treatment of COVID, and they said we were too little critical about the government and everything they did. The media was just covering it, and people got a totally distorted view of reality, like everything's about COVID and what about the rest. And I just think if every evening for like 10 days, they would show children drowning in the Mediterranean Sea in front of European borders, I bet you could not stand there and have a politician say, we have to handle other things first. And then you would have the right-wingers who would say, you know, they're only showing children dying, but there's bad people coming in. But I think it's important to not give up the agenda and not let the others rule. And I think it's very important in Croatia, where I just came from, there's like the new normality. We have to live in a new normal. And I don't know how long COVID's going to rule our lives, but I feel like we have all these measures that help it. So we have to get out of it and find a way to set the agenda and bring up the big democratic things that we have to come up with. Also not to lose the people who will be by time frustrated by the effects of the measures that COVID will have on people's lives. So my thing is tell the stories that you care about and set the agenda.
I want to thank all 3 of you for this incredibly informative and deeply nuanced conversation. Obviously, this is an incredibly complex and multifaceted issue. As you've shown us, the outlook might not be wholly optimistic, but there is some hope. And certainly with 3 individuals like you working on this issue, my hope is that there can be some structural change, some structural reform, and certainly some improvements. But Jagoda, Victoria, thank you so much for your insights. And Adam, thank you for doing a wonderful, wonderful job of leading us through this very complex issue.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Adam, for the tough questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.